All right, so welcome back, everyone. In the previous video, we learned how to calculate productivity, which was GDP per worker. And this graph here just kind of shows the extent to productivity differences across the world, right? So you can tell the number of countries in each of these bins, right? So there's a decent number of countries up here in the very productive group where productivity is $100,000 per worker or more. And then we just kind of go down the line. And the thing to note is that there's still quite a few countries where productivity is relatively low, meaning GDP per worker is relatively low. And of course, if productivity is low, standard of living is likely to be low as well, right? So one of the things we want to try to understand here is what drives some of these productivity differences across countries. Before we get to that question, which we will, I wanted to think about some alternative measures for standard of living. So we're currently measuring standard of living, and it's a pretty good way to do it with GDP per capita. So the idea is that the higher GDP per capita is, the higher your standard of living. Now, you can argue that income per person doesn't necessarily measure everything that we would think is important for standard of living. So, for example, I may want to know about healthcare, right? So I may live in a country with a lot of income, but if I can't get healthcare, for example, my standard of living could be much lower, or pollution, or some of these other things, access to education, etc. And so we're going to look at a particular alternative measure of standard of living that it turns out in the end is pretty correlated with GDP per capita. So GDP per capita turns out in the end to be, roughly speaking, about as good as we can do, all else the same. So a few things to kind of look at here. So this is just to kind of note how much of the world's population is actually living in fairly severe poverty, right? So each dot here corresponds to a country. And along the bottom axis here, I have GDP per person. So now that's average, right? And so you could get a very high average GDP per person by having a small group of very wealthy people and then a much larger group of very poor people. And so one way to see if that's the case is to look at the percentage of the population that lives in poverty. So in this graph, we're looking at the percentage of the population that lives on less than $1.90 a day. And so what we see is that, there's a lot of countries where more than half of the country lives on less than $1.90 a day in US dollars, and that's purchasing power parity adjusted. So imagine if you woke up every day and you basically had $2 to live on. What would life be like? And it wouldn't be very good, right? So one thing we want to always remember is really how lucky we are to live where we do, and we have a very well-off lifestyle. All else the same. So we get caught up in, do I make a little bit more or less than this person or that person? And if I compare myself to somebody in Congo here, well, the small differences we argue over is nothing compared to what their lives look like. So at any rate, the higher your GDP per capita on average, the much less likely it is you live in a country with a lot of poverty. All right. So what about life expectancy, right? So in other words, how does GDP correlate with how long I'm going to live? And what we see is that there's a pretty good positive correlation, right? The higher the GDP per capita, the longer your life expectancy is going to be. And so if you notice, right, in this country here, it's the Republic of Congo, they had a very high rate of poverty. And on average, people live much shorter lives there. The primary reason for that is that their infant mortality rate is very high, right? So if you're born in a very poor country, it's very likely that you don't survive your first year of life. That has a lot of reasons behind that. But we can see that having more GDP per capita makes you more likely to live a longer life, and that helps us have a higher standard of living. So the point here is that with all of these other things that I think of as mattering for measuring standard of living, GDP correlates very well with those. So one alternative to GDP per capita to measure standard of living is what we call a Human Development Index. And this is based on three factors. What we just talked about, life expectancy. It also includes education. So access to education for children, right? What percentage of the population under, say, 16 is going to school? And then we also just think in terms of total educational attainment, right? What percentage of the population gets an advanced degree, college or technical college, right? So access to education, and then, of course, GDP per capita or income per capita, right? So we're going to take with it GDP, and we're going to add these other features that we think matter, life expectancy and education. And so, like you go to the homework, and there's a question like, let's say in a country, educational attainment increases. Does the Human Development Index increase, decrease, or we don't know? And why, right? And so there's really kind of two ways I could answer this, right? I could say, yes, the Human Development Index increases because education is part of it. And if education goes up, it should increase, right? But it kind of depends, right? So I think that the better answer is, because what happens to the other stuff, right? So if education correlates positively with, say, GDP and life expectancy, then I know that the Human Development Index is going to go up. So if education correlates positively with life expectancy and GDP, yes, Human Development Index goes up. And the same would be true if life expectancy went up, right? Life expectancy, we already showed, is positively correlated with GDP. So if my life expectancy went up, in fact, my Human Development Index would go up because life expectancy and GDP are positively correlated, right? So life expectancy going up would tell me GDP went up. I know for sure then my Human Development Index is increasing. Okay, so it's an alternative measure. Couple questions. One question on the homework that kind of gets you to think about some relationships, calling back the idea of correlations. So we remember that. And that wraps up the Human Development Index. So where we're going to go next is and here's some, you can look at some pictures of Human Development Index in various countries and see, that other than the rare exception of South Korea, the rankings have been relatively stable. And these developing countries are getting closer to the United States, but haven't quite gotten there yet, right? So a few looks here at various countries and where they relate in the Human Development Index, which is interesting. And then what we're going to do next is try to understand what are the reasons that these differences exist.